The story I want to tell you this morning comes mainly from the book of Exodus. There are lots of ways to approach stories from Hebrew or Christian scripture. We could look at the science behind it. We're not going to do that. We could look at the history and decide whether it's literally true or not. I'm not going to do that either. You should feel free to do that, but I'm not going to do that this morning. This morning, I invite you to listen for a guiding story in the story of the history of Sabbath. I think this story reminds us that the Jewish Sabbath was initially a radical, even politically subversive practice. The story begins with Pharaoh, a man of immeasurable wealth and power. It reminds me of this show I sometimes watch, American Greed. Have you seen the show American Greed? It's all about American CEOs who get greedy, decide to scheme the system, and end up going to jail, or as often as not, don't end up going to jail. Many of their stories have similarities. At first, they get a handful of people, some of them, to give them $1 million apiece, say, by promising astronomical returns on their investments, 30% in 2 months on $1 million. They spread out the payment dates, and they pay the various donors with the money from the other donors. In the meantime, they're skimming off the original investments. Now, you can't do that forever, of course. Their pyramid schemes require more and more investors, more and more money, more and more work on their part to cultivate investors. So these folks begin working night and day to find more cash until somebody finally calls them on it. Or somebody wants their money right now, and it all comes crashing down around them. These CEOs often become so anxious, their plans require so much round-the-clock management that a good number of them at the end of the show say, you know, I was kind of glad when it was over. The Egyptian Pharaoh had his own sort of pyramid scheme. See what I did there? I didn't know if anybody would get it or not. But you're a very sharp crowd. I appreciate that about you. There's a scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who is a Hebrew Bible professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. He writes, Egypt's socioeconomic power was organized like a pyramid, with a workforce producing wealth, all of which flowed upward to the power elite and eventually to Pharaoh, who sat atop the pyramid, end quote. He had slaves to build supplies, including the Israelites, who spent their days making bricks, gathering straw to make bricks. He had piles of food, hordes of animals, entire cities built primarily to store the supplies, to store the overflow. He was wealthy. But as the very wealthy sometimes are, Pharaoh was anxious. What if it all went away? It could. So he overtaxed the land and the animals and the people in a frenzied effort to get more and more and more. There is no time to rest in an economy like this one. One day, as the story goes, God heard the cry of the Israelites, ground down by the constant churn of Pharaoh's economic machine, with never a day to rest. And God sent Moses to confront Pharaoh with a simple message: let my people go. Pharaoh's response to Moses shows that he sees the Israelites as a cog, a piece in his machine, not as fellow human beings. These quotes are all from the same chapter of Exodus. Why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors. You just want them to stop working. You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they made previously. Don't diminish it, for they are lazy. You shall not lessen your daily number of bricks. The solution is they need to work more hours, he says. foreshadowing a modern-day politician. I mentioned that last week too. I'll give it up now. When the assumption of continual upward growth begins to crumble, it isn't the person at the top who pays first. Pharaoh sees the demand for freedom as a direct threat to his pyramid economy. Eventually, Pharaoh decides to let his brickmakers go. And he then quickly gets over that momentary lapse and chases them to the banks of the Red Sea, where God and Charlton Heston, to many of us, miraculously deliver the Israelites across on dry land and drown Pharaoh and his army. And here stand the Israelites, a people now, not brickmakers, not any longer, not slaves, not on this side of the Red Sea. Now, they're children of God. That is quite a change in identity. They wander to Mount Sinai, where God begins to work with Moses and the people to shape this community. No longer just parts in Pharaoh's economy. Okay, but how shall we live now? And the answer is found in the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments aren't often admired in Unitarian Universalist circles. We might prefer the 10 gentle suggestions or the 10 requests, if you don't mind. But I want to invite you to see them not as just a list of rules, but as a revolution, a politically subversive anti-Pharaoh community manifesto, because I think that's what they were. Pharaoh regarded himself as a god. And in the pantheon of the gods surrounding Pharaoh were many gods who used up people and the earth for their pleasure. Used up people like the Israelites. And so let there be no more people who claim God status. Let there be no more greedy gods. Let there be no gods before the God of the Israelites. There are prohibitions against theft and murder and coveting. But the hinge to the whole 10 commandments, the longest of the commandments, in fact, is the 4th commandment. Think politically subversive and hear the language here. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or any immigrant residing in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Here there is instituted a system of rest to counter Pharaoh's system of anxiety. Everyone is included in the Sabbath command, every person. Though not everyone is equal in access to economics in a coercive system, in access to rest, this command becomes a great equalizer. Everyone rests on the Sabbath. Brueggemann writes, there was no pause from working in Egypt. But now Yahweh nullifies that entire system of anxious production. There are limits to how much and how long slaves must produce bricks. There are limits to how much food Pharaoh can store and consume and administer. The limit is set by the weekly work pause that breaks the production cycle. And those who participate in it break the anxiety cycle. They're invited to awareness that life does not consist in frantic production and consumption that reduces everyone else to threat and competitor. And as the work stoppage permits a waning of anxiety, so energy is redeployed to the neighborhood. The odd insistence of the God of Sinai is to counter anxious productivity with committed neighborliness. The latter practice does not produce so much, but it creates an environment of security and respect and dignity that redefines the human project. The justification for the work stoppage for Sabbath is the creation account. The part of Genesis which contains the creation account would probably have been used in worship. So the priest might have said, "And on the first day God separated the light from dark." And the congregation might have responded, "And it was good." So on. And then, reported as the culmination of this liturgy, God rests. Brueggemann says, God rested on the seventh day. God did not show up to do more. God absented God's self from the office. God did not come and check on creation in anxiety to be sure it was all working. God has complete confidence in the fruit-bearing, blessing-generating processes of creation that have been instituted. God exhibits no anxiety about the life-giving capacity of creation. God is not a workaholic. God is not a Pharaoh. God does not keep jacking up the production schedules. To the contrary, God rests. There is then a cascade of effects. Because God rests, the people rest. All the people, citizen and immigrant, owning class and servant. And because the people rest, the animals and the earth rest. And out of this great rest comes a reconnection with deepest held values and neighbors. No stealing, a certain kind of community, no murdering, no coveting. Those are the things that happen when we see one another as competitors. In a community that knows how to rest, a person can lift up their head and look around, have a conversation with a neighbor or a friend, and rehumanize all the people who might serve them in various ways on the other 6 days. The Israelites famously wandered for many more years until finally they stood at the edge of the Promised Land. What a moment. They were going from the desert into a land that would produce everything they would need. Moses seems to have understood that the abundance in this land might well create in the Israelites a tendency to no longer trust that the earth would provide everything they would need. And with such prosperity, maybe they would feel the need to store up food and materials, because they could, to have servants make bricks for them, to ward off a future time of scarcity. They might, in fact, be tempted to become oppressors, demanding more and more of the people who serve them, becoming fearful of immigrants taking American jobs, Israelite jobs, and stuff. Prosperity can do that. They may forget their neighbors and begin again to see them as competitors rather than partners in community. As Brueggemann says, prosperity breeds amnesia. So at the borderland of the border of the promised land of prosperity, Moses stands and reminds the people not to forget by reciting one more time the 10 Commandments. Only this time, the fourth commandment is a little bit different. The justification for the Sabbath has changed. At Sinai, remember, the justification for resting every seventh day was, you do this because this is what God did when God created. But in Deuteronomy, with Moses standing at the edge of the promised land, listen to this. A lot of it is the same as Sinai. Remember the Sabbath day, no work for you or your animals or anybody else. But here's the justification. Why a day of rest? Because you were slaves in Egypt. And God brought you out of there. In other words, don't ever treat anyone as a part in the machine, the way you were treated. Do you remember? That's why you rest. To remember never to recreate Pharaoh's pyramid. Wealth flowing to the top, this crush the workers' economy. As one author said, the economy is not a rat race in which people remain exhausted from coercive goals. It is rather a covenantal enterprise for the sake of the whole community. Moses ended up being right if he was concerned about the things I just said. The people did get prosperity amnesia. They did really well in the Promised Land. Things were so good, in fact, that Solomon built a temple in which almost everything was either gold or overlaid in gold. Clearly a show of wealth and power for the people who would travel through the city. The prophet Amos records that many kept the Sabbath rules, but they forgot the spirit of the Sabbath. He said, people say, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great and practice deceit with false balances. In other words, when will this Sabbath be over so that we can get back to cheating the poor and making money? Even in keeping the Sabbath, the values of community and neighborliness were often forgotten. The subversive, politically challenging spirit of a day of rest became an empty set of laws to some. And here we are. Most of us either at the bottom or in the middle of a pyramid scheme that mirrors that of Pharaoh. We're working more hours than we ever have, even as the gap between the wealthiest and the poor is greater than it has been in 200 years. We are parts, it appears, in an economy of acquisition in which it's easy to buy into the notion that life is about accumulating things and working long hours to pay for them. The Sabbath work stoppage has never been more important, and it has never been easy. For the Israelites, it required a miracle. For us, it requires intentionality. But if we can find it, if we can make regular space for the kind of rest in which we reconnect with our deepest held values of community and justice and peace, it just may spark our imaginations to find ways out of our own version of Pharaoh's manipulative pyramid scheme. Ultimately, when we're transformed by Sabbath, what becomes possible is real justice. When we no longer see ourselves as commodities, it becomes easier for us to see our neighbors as fully human too. And the Sabbath commandment is not just for me. It's not just about taking a nap once a week, although I certainly support that. It's about the transformation of society, about freeing not just the Sabbath practitioner, but the entire culture and the earth itself from the grip of acquisition, constant acquisition. So, you want to be really radical? Want to really change our system? Well, if you have the guts for it, rest. Reconnect. Remember who and whose you are. It takes some courage to do that. Then fight for fair treatment of undocumented immigrants, which might allow them to rest too. Work to have everyone treated as a neighbor, not a competitor. These are the radical commandments of the first Sabbath, still desperately needed today. Amen.